The morning light spilled over the wide Texas horizon, stretching long shadows across Helen Marsh's porch. From her seat in the old wicker chair, she could see her daughter Emily moving about inside the house, her silhouette flitting past the window in her white graduation dress, a cap and gown hanging neatly on the bedroom door. The sight should have filled Helen with nothing but pride. After all, she'd been waiting 22 years for this day, and yet beneath the swell of pride, something in her chest felt heavy. Helen's fingers curled around the chipped handle of her coffee mug. She'd told herself for months that the unease she felt was just age catching up with her. A touch of melancholy at watching her little girl grow up and step into the world. But deep down, she knew it wasn't that. It was something else. Something that had started creeping into her marriage like a slow leak in a roof. Quiet, barely noticeable at first, until you wake up one day and find half the floor ruined. Her husband Mark had always been steady, dependable. He wasn't the sort to spring surprises or take sudden interest in new hobbies. And yet over the past year, his patterns had shifted. First it was late nights at the office, then the gym membership, then the shopping bags with expensive clothes that didn't look like anything she'd ever seen him wear before. And there were the phone calls. Mark had never been secretive with his phone, but recently Helen had noticed the way he turned slightly away from her when answering, his voice lowered, his words careful, too careful. When she'd ask, he'd smile and say it was just work. She wanted to believe him. God, she wanted to believe him. But then there was Thanksgiving. Helen could remember it as clearly as if it were yesterday. Her sister Linda had been the last to arrive, breezing in with her usual dramatic flair. Bright red lipstick, hair freshly blown out, the smell of expensive perfume clinging to her scarf. She'd laughed at one of Mark's jokes across the table, and in that moment, Helen caught a look pass between them. Not a long look, not even one most people would notice. But Helen did. It was quick, intimate, like a shared secret. She'd told herself she was imagining things. Linda had always been flirty by nature, the kind of woman who leaned in too close when talking to men, who brushed a hand against an arm mid-laugh. It didn't mean anything. And Mark? Well, Mark was her husband of 32 years. Still, that look haunted her. In the weeks that followed, Helen found herself rewinding moments in her mind. Linda staying in the kitchen with Mark, while Helen was setting the table in the dining room. Mark offering to drop something off at Linda's place when it was only a 5-minute drive, and returning nearly an hour later. It wasn't enough to accuse either of them, but it was enough to plant a seed. Helen took a slow sip of coffee, her eyes drifting back to Emily's window. Her daughter's laughter floated through the open pane, sweet and unguarded. Helen forced herself to smile. She wouldn't let suspicion spoil this day for Emily. She leaned back in the chair, letting the porch creak under her weight. The sun was climbing higher, burning away the cool morning air, promising the heavy heat that only a Texas May could bring. Inside, Emily was calling out for her shoes, her voice light with excitement. Helen stood and stepped inside, smoothing her blouse. She caught her reflection in the hallway mirror. The faint lines around her eyes, the silver strands woven through her chestnut hair, and thought about how much life had been lived between those lines. Mark's voice came from the kitchen, casual, warm, as if everything was normal. But Helen knew better than to mistake warmth for truth. Today was Emily's day. Helen would smile, she would clap, she would cheer until her voice was hoarse. But somewhere in the back of her mind, she would keep watching. Because sometimes the biggest betrayals didn't announce themselves in a storm. They slipped in on quiet feet, hiding behind familiar smiles. And Helen had learned, over the course of her life, that it was the quiet storms you had to watch for the most. A week before the graduation, the air in the Marsh household felt tighter somehow. The kitchen clock ticked louder, the silences between conversations stretched longer, and Helen could sense that invisible thread pulling taut between her and Mark. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon. Helen had been folding laundry in the bedroom, the soft hum of the dryer filling the space, when she heard Mark's voice drifting down the hall. She paused, a sock in her hand, and listened. Yeah, I can't wait to see you that night, he was saying, low but distinct. Helen froze, her heartbeat quickening. That night? What night? Before she could step closer, his tone shifted. Right, right. I'll handle it. See you then. The soft click of the phone ending the call seemed louder than it should have been. By the time Helen stepped into the doorway, Mark was in the kitchen, phone on the counter, pouring himself a glass of water as if nothing had happened. She could have asked. She could have said, "Who was that?" But Helen had learned over the years that questions asked too soon can sound like accusations, and accusations without proof can be turned back on you. Instead, she tucked it away. That evening, Linda called. Her voice on the other end was syrupy sweet, all smiles Helen could hear but not see. Hey, sis, I'm coming down for Emily's graduation. Wouldn't miss it for the world. Helen's mouth formed the words, That's great, but her stomach tightened. She thought of the last time they'd spoken, 2 months ago, when Linda had brushed off an invitation to brunch, saying she was too busy, and then posting pictures from a lakeside cafe. You sure it's not too much trouble? Helen asked, testing. Oh, please, Linda said with a laugh. I'll be there cheering my niece on. And maybe we can all go out afterward, celebrate as a family? Helen's eyes flicked toward the kitchen, where Mark was rinsing a dish. She didn't miss the way his shoulders lifted slightly at the sound of Linda's voice through the receiver. In that moment, something small but sharp twisted inside Helen. She and Linda had grown up inseparable, sharing clothes, secrets, even heartbreaks. Linda had been there when Helen met Mark, had toasted them at their wedding with a speech so touching it had brought Helen to tears. But in recent months, that closeness had faded, not in an explosive way, but in the slow, quiet manner that leaves you wondering when exactly it started. Helen told herself she was overthinking. This was about Emily, after all. The last thing she wanted was to create tension before such an important milestone. Still, there were moments that week that gnawed at her. Mark insisting on booking the post-graduation dinner himself, brushing off her suggestions with, I've got it handled. Linda texting to ask, What's Emily wearing? I want to make sure I match the mood, as though the day were some sort of coordinated performance. Emily, for her part, was blissfully unaware. She floated between study sessions and gown fittings, her face glowing with anticipation. Helen envied that innocence, the way her daughter could still believe that family was a safe, solid thing. One evening, as Helen was ironing Emily's dress, Mark came into the room with a curious smile. Big day coming, he said, leaning against the doorframe. Yes, Helen replied, pressing the iron down slowly, watching the steam rise. Afterward, I've got something special planned, he said. Just the immediate family. Her hand paused mid-stroke. Immediate family? She echoed. You, me, Emily, and Linda, he clarified, as if that order was obvious. Helen forced a smile, but inside she felt the old Thanksgiving memory stir. Linda's red scarf, the look across the table, the quiet connection they'd tried to hide. She thought about asking what the something special was, but didn't. If Mark was going to surprise her, she would let him. Surprises, after all, reveal more than people realize, especially when they're not the surprises you asked for. That night, lying in bed, Helen stared at the ceiling fan spinning slowly above her. The house was quiet except for the occasional creak of the wood. Beside her, Mark's breathing was steady even. Helen closed her eyes and told herself one thing. Whatever this was, whatever truth lay behind the strange phone calls and knowing glances, she would not let it ruin Emily's day. But that didn't mean she'd stop paying attention. 2 days before graduation, Helen drove into town to pick up Emily's pressed gown and a pale blue dress she'd ordered from a boutique for herself. The shop was small, one of those places where the owner knew most customers by name. As Helen stepped inside, the air conditioning wrapped around her like a blessing from the Texas heat. She was waiting near the counter when the bell over the door jingled and 2 women walked in, their conversation carrying easily in the quiet store. And he wasn't even subtle about it, one of them was saying, her voice a mixture of disbelief and excitement. I told you, the other replied. Married man, wife's sister. They were all over each other at that vineyard out by Kerrville last month. Classy, huh? Helen's fingers stilled on the receipt she was holding. She tried not to look at them, but her ears caught every word. Tall guy, maybe mid-50s, kind of salt and pepper hair. Drove a silver SUV? Yep, And she had that red scarf, like she wanted everyone to notice her. It was ridiculous, she told herself. There must be hundreds of tall, middle-aged men with SUVs in Texas, and plenty of women who liked red scarves. But her heart thudded anyway, because Mark drove a silver SUV. And Linda. Linda had worn that red scarf at Thanksgiving. Helen accepted her dress with a polite smile, her mind elsewhere. By the time she stepped back into the afternoon sun, her certainty had shifted from fog to something denser, more solid. On the drive home, she tested the waters. Mark was sitting on the porch when she pulled in, scrolling through his phone. "Ran into some women at the boutique," she said casually, unlocking the trunk. "They were talking about that vineyard outside Kerrville, the one with the live music on weekends." For just a second, a heartbeat's worth, Mark's eyes flicked up and then away, too quickly. "Never been," he said, standing to take the garment bag from her hands. "Sounds nice, though." He kissed her cheek as if to punctuate the thought, but Helen caught the faint stiffness in it. That night, long after Mark had fallen asleep, Helen sat in the dim light of her bedroom lamp and opened Linda's social media. Her sister had never been careful about what she posted. Mostly sunsets, wine glasses, the occasional selfie with a new hairstyle. Helen scrolled back to mid-April and stopped cold. There it was, a wine glass with the logo of the Kerrville Vineyard etched into it. The background blurred, but familiar enough to match the women's description. The caption read, "Perfect evening." No tag for Mark, of course, but Helen noticed the reflection in the glass. A shape, broad-shouldered, wearing a dark shirt. She sat back, her stomach turning. It wasn't proof anyone else would take to court, but it was proof enough for her. Her mind replayed the moments she'd ignored. Linda laughing too hard at Mark's jokes, the way he poured her wine before anyone else's, their disappearing acts during family gatherings. Helen's first instinct was to pick up the phone and call her sister right then, to demand the truth. But she stopped herself. If she confronted them now, she'd get denial. She'd get lies so smoothly told she might start doubting herself again. She needed something undeniable. Helen closed the app and set her phone on the nightstand. Tomorrow was the rehearsal ceremony for graduation. She'd be there early. She'd be watching. And if there was anything to catch, she'd catch it herself. Some betrayals, she thought, needed to be dragged into the light at the exact right moment. Not for revenge, but for clarity. And right now, clarity was what she wanted more than anything. Graduation morning broke warm and bright, the kind of Texas spring day where the sun feels confident enough to steal the cool from the air before noon. Helen was up before the alarm, moving quietly through the kitchen so the clink of the coffee pot wouldn't wake Emily too soon. She wanted her daughter's morning to be perfect, calm, unrushed, the kind of day she would remember for the rest of her life. She poured her coffee and sat at the table, the steam curling against her face. In front of her lay Emily's sash and cap, pressed to perfection, and the pale blue dress Helen had picked up earlier in the week. She smoothed her hand over the fabric, letting herself feel the softness before she stood to get ready. Her movements that morning carried a precision she hadn't felt in years. She chose her jewelry, simple pearl earrings and her mother's silver bracelet, and applied her makeup with steady hands. Then as she slipped on her dress, she reached for her handbag and, without hesitation, tucked her phone and a small digital voice recorder inside. It wasn't paranoia anymore. It was preparation. Mark appeared in the hallway just as she was fastening the bracelet. He looked sharp, new charcoal suit, pressed white shirt, tie a shade darker than the suit. He smiled at her in a way that might have melted her years ago, but today she found herself studying it, looking for cracks. "You look beautiful," he said, leaning in for a kiss. Helen returned it lightly. "So do you." Minutes later, Linda's arrival was marked by the low rumble of a car in the driveway and the sound of heels on the pavement. Helen glanced through the window before opening the door. Her sister was dressed in a striking red sheath dress that hit just below the knee, paired with gold earrings that caught the sunlight. Her perfume floated in ahead of her, the same expensive one Helen had noticed last Thanksgiving. "Well, don't you both clean up nice," Linda said, smiling at Mark first, then at Helen. Helen offered a polite smile. "Emily's almost ready." When Emily emerged radiant in her cap and gown, all three adults seemed to exhale at once. For Helen, it was pride that loosened her chest. For Mark and Linda, she wasn't so sure. The drive to the university was filled with small talk about parking and the weather. Helen sat in the front passenger seat while Mark drove, Linda in the back with Emily. She caught their reflections in the rearview mirror. Linda leaning forward slightly when she spoke to Mark, her hand brushing the back of his seat once. At the venue, the campus was alive with color, clusters of graduates in robes, families carrying flowers and balloons, the air buzzing with celebration. Helen let the energy soak into her bones, steadying her nerves. They took seats a few rows from the stage, Emily disappearing into the graduates area. Helen placed herself so that she was just behind Mark and Linda, an angle that let her see their interactions without appearing to watch. Mark leaned in to speak to Linda during the speeches. Helen couldn't catch the words, but the low timbre of his voice and Linda's soft laugh felt like an intrusion into what should have been Emily's moment. Helen kept her face neutral, her hands folded in her lap, but inside she was a taut wire. When Emily's name was called, she rose gracefully, walked across the stage, and shook hands with the dean. Helen's heart swelled, her pride so fierce it nearly drowned out everything else. She clapped until her palms stung. But even as she watched her daughter accept the diploma, a flicker of movement in the row ahead caught her eye. Linda's hand resting briefly on Mark's knee. Quick, casual to anyone else, but damning to Helen. She felt the familiar weight of her phone in her bag, her fingers itching toward it. Not yet. The day wasn't over, and Helen was going to let the truth reveal itself in the most unforgettable way possible. After the ceremony, the crowd spilled out onto the campus lawn, the air thick with the scent of fresh flowers and the sound of cameras clicking. Graduates clustered with friends, tossing caps into the air, parents jockeying for the best spot to take photos. Mark suggested they head toward the old oak trees at the far end of the quad. Better light for pictures, he said, glancing at Linda with a small, knowing smile. Helen followed a few steps behind, her heels sinking slightly into the soft grass. She kept her gaze steady, her expression calm, but her senses were tuned to every movement in front of her. Emily spotted a group of friends and rushed over to greet them, leaving the three adults together. Mark took Linda's elbow lightly, steering her toward the shade of the trees. They thought they were far enough from Helen that she wouldn't notice, or maybe they simply didn't care anymore. As Helen neared, she saw Linda lean in, her lips close to Mark's ear. "Baby, that was perfect," Linda whispered, her voice warm and intimate. Mark's hand brushed hers, his voice just as low. "I can't wait until tonight." Helen didn't hesitate. She slid her phone from her bag and hit the record button, keeping it angled down but pointed toward them. The lens caught enough, their posture, their proximity, and most importantly, their voices. She stopped a few feet back, pretending to admire the flowers planted around the base of the oak. Her heart pounded, but her face gave nothing away. From somewhere nearby, a photographer called out, "Family photo?" Mark straightened instantly, plastering on his husband and father smile. Linda smoothed her dress and stepped back just enough to make it look appropriate. Emily ran over, breathless from laughing with her friends. "Let's take one by the tree," she said, completely unaware of the shift in the air. Helen slipped her phone back into her bag and joined them for the photo, her smile steady but her eyes fixed ahead. The camera captured what the day seemed to be. A proud family celebrating their daughter's achievement. But in Helen's bag, her phone now held the truth. They moved through the rest of the afternoon in a blur of handshakes and congratulations. Helen let the others take the lead, content to drift at the edge of conversations. She was already thinking ahead, not just to what she'd say, but how she'd say it. When Mark announced it was time to head to the dinner he'd arranged, Helen simply nodded. The plan was unfolding exactly as she needed it to. The restaurant was a cozy, upscale place tucked into a historic building downtown. Linen tablecloths, polished wood floors, the scent of rosemary and garlic drifting from the kitchen. The kind of place where conversation stayed low and the clink of cutlery carried. They were shown to a corner table, intimate but still in view of several other diners. Helen noted the placement with silent satisfaction. This wasn't going to happen in a hidden booth. Emily sat between Helen and Linda, with Mark across from Helen. The seating arrangement was almost too perfect, a stage waiting for its scene. Menus were passed, drinks ordered. Mark was in high spirits, talking about Emily's future plans. Linda chiming in with little stories from their childhood. Helen nodded at the right moments, her hands resting lightly on the table. When the main courses were served, Mark tapped his glass with a fork. "Before we eat, I just want to say how proud I am," he began, looking at Emily. "This is a big day for our family." Linda smiled at him, the kind of smile that reached the eyes for all the wrong reasons. Helen's fingers brushed the phone in her lap. The time had come. She set her fork down, her voice calm. "I'd like to add something to that." Both Mark and Linda turned toward her, polite smiles still in place. Helen lifted her phone and pressed play. The sound of Linda's voice filled the table. "Baby, that was perfect." Then Mark's reply, "I can't wait until tonight." The restaurant's soft background murmur faltered as nearby tables caught the words. Emily's eyes widened, darting from her father to her aunt. Linda's smile crumpled first. Mark's face went pale, his mouth opening, but no words coming. Helen didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "I think Emily deserves to know who's been betraying our family," she said, each word deliberate. The silence that followed was absolute. For a moment, it was as if the air itself had been sucked out of the room. The clink of silverware from other tables stopped. A server froze mid-step, eyes darting toward their table. Helen kept her phone on the table. The screen still lit, the recording still playing. "Baby, that was perfect. I can't wait until tonight." Linda's lipstick-red mouth opened, then shut again, her gold earrings trembling with the quick tilt of her head. "Helen, it's not—" "Not what?" Helen asked softly, her gaze locked on her sister's face. "Not your voice? Not my husband's voice?" Mark leaned forward, his hands flat on the table. "Helen, this isn't the place." "This is exactly the place," she cut in, her voice calm, even. "You chose to have this dinner. You chose to bring her here, and you both chose to betray me. So yes, Mark, this is the place." Emily sat frozen between them, her fork untouched, her eyes flicking back and forth as if trying to reconcile the people she loved with the strangers in front of her. "Dad, Aunt Linda, is this true?" Neither of them answered. The silence was louder than any confession. Helen let it sit there, let the weight of it press down on them. She'd always believed that people reveal themselves when you stop talking and simply wait. And right now they were showing Emily exactly who they were. Finally, Linda shifted in her seat, her voice barely above a whisper. "It just happened." Helen's laugh was sharp but short. "Things like this don't just happen. They are planned, chosen, repeated. And you had a choice every single time." She turned her gaze to Mark. "And so did you." Mark's face was pale, his jaw tight. "It's not what you think," he muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. Helen tilted her head. "Then by all means, explain it to your daughter." Emily's voice broke then, low and shaking. "You're supposed to be family, both of you." She pushed her chair back so abruptly it scraped against the wood floor. The sound seemed to snap Mark out of whatever fog he was in. "Emily," he started, reaching for her arm, but she stepped away. "No," she said, tears bright in her eyes. "I'm going with Mom." Helen stood slowly, her hands steady. She picked up her bag and slid her phone inside. "Enjoy your dinner," she said, her tone almost polite, but the steel underneath was unmistakable. "I won't be part of this anymore." She felt every pair of eyes in the restaurant following her as she walked toward the door, Emily right beside her. They didn't rush. Helen wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing her flee. As they stepped out into the warm evening air, the door closing softly behind them, Helen inhaled deeply. The scent of rosemary and garlic was replaced by the night's open air, heavy with Texas heat but cleaner somehow. On the sidewalk, Emily's voice wavered. "Mom, I had no idea." Helen slipped her arm around her daughter's shoulders. "I know you didn't, and that's why I wanted you to hear it from them, or in this case, from their own mouths." They walked in silence for a block before Helen's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen. Mark's name. She let it ring, then turned the phone off completely. That night, Helen and Emily stayed in a small bed and breakfast a few miles out of town. The owner, a kind woman with a voice like warm honey, didn't ask questions when Helen booked the last available room. In the quiet of that room, Emily curled up on one of the twin beds, her cap and gown folded neatly at the foot. Helen sat by the window, looking out at the dark stretch of road beyond. For the first time in months, she felt something loosening inside her. Not relief exactly. The hurt was still sharp, the betrayal raw, but a clarity she hadn't had before. Tomorrow would be for lawyers, for decisions about the future, for figuring out how to untangle 32 years of marriage. But tonight, Helen let herself sit in the truth, and she knew this much. Whatever came next, she would face it without them. Word traveled fast in their corner of Texas. By Monday morning, Helen couldn't go to the grocery store without catching someone's glance linger a second too long, or overhearing her name murmured in an aisle. She didn't mind. In fact, the more people knew, the less explaining she had to do. Mark didn't waste time trying to deny it. He called twice the next day. Helen let both go to voicemail. His messages were awkward mixtures of apology and anger, the tones shifting as if he couldn't decide whether to beg or demand. Linda sent a single text. "I'm sorry you found out that way." Helen didn't reply. Emily stayed with her for the week following graduation. The laughter in the house came in small doses, but it came, usually in the mornings over coffee, when Emily would tell a story about a friend from school, or in the evenings when they watched an old movie together. It was in those moments Helen felt the first real cracks of light breaking through. 3 days after the dinner, Helen met with a divorce attorney. She laid out the facts plainly. The recording, the history, the affair with her sister. The attorney didn't hide his reaction. "Given the circumstances, you'll be in a strong position," he said, flipping through his notes. "Texas courts don't look kindly on adultery, especially with a family member involved." The process moved quickly after that. Mark moved into a long-term motel, and Linda stopped showing up at family events entirely. Helen didn't ask where they were staying or whether they were still seeing each other. It no longer mattered. What mattered was that Emily had chosen to stand beside her. One evening, as they sat on the porch with the cicadas buzzing in the humid dusk, Emily turned to her. "Mom, I keep thinking about that night. How calm you were. How you didn't yell or throw anything. I don't know how you did it." Helen took a sip of her iced tea, the glass sweating in her hand. "Because if I'd yelled, they'd have made it about my reaction, not their actions. This way, everyone saw the truth exactly as it was." Emily was quiet for a moment. "You're stronger than I realized." Helen smiled faintly. "Sometimes we don't know how strong we are until we have no other choice." In the weeks that followed, life settled into a new rhythm. The paperwork went through. The house was hers outright. The joint accounts were closed, and Helen opened one in her name only. She started going back to the community events she'd once avoided. The farmers market on Saturdays, the church luncheons, even the small-town book club. People approached her carefully at first, but when she met their eyes with steady warmth, they relaxed. The story had already been told, and Helen was the one who had walked away with her dignity intact. As summer deepened, Emily prepared to move to Dallas for her first job. They spent their last week together packing boxes, labeling each with neat black letters. On the final night, they ordered pizza, sat cross-legged on the living room floor, and talked until the small hours. When Helen dropped her off at her new apartment, they hugged for a long time at the door. "Call me if you need anything," Helen said. "I will," Emily promised. Then with a mischievous smile, she added, "And I'll screen any new people you date." Helen laughed, really laughed, for the first time in months. "Deal." Back home, the house was quiet, but it didn't feel empty. Helen fixed herself a cup of coffee and carried it out to the porch. The same wicker chair waited for her, the boards creaking softly under her weight. The Texas sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. She breathed it in, the warmth, the stillness, the sense of space where the tension used to live. Mark and Linda's absence wasn't a wound anymore. It was a clearing. Helen didn't know exactly what her future would look like, but she knew this. It would be hers, free of the lies and shadows that had been sitting at her table for too long. She took a slow sip, her eyes on the horizon. Sometimes, she thought, the sweetest kind of justice isn't loud or vengeful. It's simply living well enough that those who betrayed you are left outside, watching a life they can no longer touch.